This is a short summary of Pathwork Lecture 166, which was the August 2020 topic of Pathwork Steps meetings and newsletters. And what I do is I break the lecture topic down into 4 subtopics so that we can look at one aspect of the lecture at a time. So I'll list off the 4 and then go into them. The first was to examine the words perceiving, reacting, and expressing and find out what it means to you. The second was that in utilizing this tool, which I will explain, it allows you to enter a threshold or go through a threshold of spiritual development. The third is that these 3 principles are the threefold principle of all relationship. And the fourth was that self-love empowers relationship. Doesn't take anything away from it, it empowers it. So the first one, what I titled it was Freedom equals facing plus experiencing plus expressing. And what I found was that we need to look at different words for the phrases that the guide uses. It's not that the words are inadequate or wrong, but we may have words that mean more to us or get us closer to the aspect of the concept that we want to work with. So using Pathwork Lecture 233, which is the power of the word, which is a lecture that I love and I absorbed very easily and quickly and I use all the time. I learned to respect people's words, and when we used different words to try to find a meeting between the two. Why am I using this word, you're using that? Or if I use a word, you may react to it and yet not be able to express. So here we are already in this little triumvirate, this little cycle, where I use a word, you perceive the word, your reaction may be different than my expectations. I may not be aware of how you react or what you're reacting to. You may or may not be able to express your reaction. So this is the classic situation where someone says something, the other person nods and proceeds onward. You think you've communicated. But until you have verified if the person heard you at all and didn't just flip you off, if they heard you at all, what did they hear? And then what did they understand from what they heard? And then what approach are they going to take to doing it or looking at it? These things are not linear and they are very unique to all of us. So in supervising in business, I learned that I needed to check how the information I was giving to people was received, how it was interpreted, and then what their intentions were in terms of what they were going to do with or about the information. So we perceive, we react, sometimes unconsciously, and then we express, and part of the expression is doing. So this is the cycle. I found that during the month, I just repeated those over and over in every single given situation. And I'm going to use a very silly example right now. I love silly examples because the monumental abstract stuff can be a bit thick sometimes. And it's easier to see a principle in something small and discrete. And then say, okay, I'll take that and I'll apply it in this more murky, emotional, or confusing area. So here's my silly example. When I initially started doing this little summary, I was wearing my normal reading glasses, which I like, but perhaps you can already see they have a tremendous glare. And as I was speaking, all I could do was react to the glare. So I thought that might happen when people were watching. It's very disconcerting, distracting. So it's important for me to perceive what I'm doing in terms of how it's going to be seen, and then to consider how people might react to it, And in terms of expression, whether there's any opportunity for them to say, you should do this again, you should do it better, or whether they say, well, that didn't work, it was very distracting, I didn't get the message, and they move on. It's a form of expressing what you think of. Another silly example is, silly meaning non-spiritual perhaps, is a slight joke that a restaurant owner's worst nightmare is a customer who, as they're walking out the door, says, wow, it was a terrible meal, I'm never coming back. Meaning they're going to go forwards into the world, they're going to talk about the restaurant in derogatory or negative terms. The restaurant owner, manager has no opportunity to do anything about it, because once they walk out, they're never coming back. You're never going to meet that person and address it. And therefore, the negative opinion is going to go out in the world without any chance of, I like the word ameliorating, modifying that by saying it wasn't intentional and we'd like to make it up. We'd like to serve you appropriately. I've had meals where I didn't like the food, but it didn't feel appropriate. It didn't feel like a big enough deal to send it back, when perhaps I should have, because that is feedback to them about what they're serving to people. And in truth, I would never order it again. I might have a negative attitude towards the restaurant. Now, why is that silly? Because it would seem like a technical objective issue, but it's not. Our reasons for not feeling good about a situation or not wanting to come back are extremely subjective. They're based on our history. They're based on our cumulative experience of what happens in restaurants, what happens when people disagree, what happens when we try to express ourselves and perhaps don't do a great job, especially if we have had that trouble with someone who's got power over us and doesn't want to hear the information. It would be a different reaction than someone who actually wishes to serve us. Now, the reason I'm going into this is that that's how simple this little cycle can be and how powerful it can be, how it happens every day of our lives, 20, 50 times a day, if not hundreds of times a day. We perceive, we react, we express. And then we go back and we perceive in a different way, react in a different way, and express. In other words, it grows, it spirals, it moves, it changes. So you might have one example in the morning, and the same thing could happen in the afternoon, and you would have a different reaction. You're more tired, you're bored, you're anxious, or you're not as tense as you were in the morning. It depends entirely on so many subjective factors that we can't be sure what's going on in somebody else's head. The pathwork is partly about how you can't be sure what's going on in your own head sometimes, that what we think may not match our feelings or our energies. And so part of spiritual work is learning to notice the discrepancies between what we say and what we do, what we express and what we actually harbor. And to get those in alignment, rather than judging one is better than the other, if there's a difference, that perhaps means we don't know the entire situation. And that's, to some extent, that's what this lecture is about. Getting the perception, reaction, and expression to match up so that it is consistent and it is in line with what we want instead of leftover stuff that we're trying to get rid of. So I invite you to play with words. When the words don't match, play with other words. What does perceiving mean to you? What are different kinds of perceiving? This is what I do, which is why I come up with all these weird and wonderful examples. Reaction, what kind of different reactions are there? And in expression, if we focus on the spoken part, we're going to miss so many other aspects of expression, because as there's a famous line, you vote with your feet. And that's a form of expression, a form that may not get another opportunity because you've just left the room, you've just left the situation. and yet that was a definitive expression of what you perceived and how you reacted to it. So play with the words and find different aspects of these, and see if you can apply different aspects or different versions of this to different situations, because that's the point of my holding meetings and discussions and my making a summary here, is this isn't something simple and subjective. This is a description of a process that can be very subtle, very involved, very complex. And it requires some practice. And to practice it, you have to work with it a little bit. And finding different ways of working with it is very useful. Here's another version of that, rather larger version of that. There's a phrase about writing that nobody ever writes anything new. It's already been written. You're just writing it differently. And as the French say about the male and female genders, vive la différence. Hooray for the differences. It is important to not simply read antique literature and not add your own personal experience to it. And when you add your personal experience, it's going to change. It's going to be different. I could say the same thing 100 years ago as I am saying today, but I'm not saying it on Zoom. I'm not saying it in the way I'm saying it. You're not hearing it in the way you might have heard it 100 years ago. It meets us differently. It touches us in different ways. For those of you who are notice details, I'm wearing ear things, a gift, birthday gift from family to bring me a little bit further into the modern technology, because I've stumbled with various headphones and earphones and so forth. The experience of something theoretically so simple as having sound without burden, having sound without a cord, having sound without it blipping back and forth, in and out, changes your perception of music, changes your perception of changes your ability to concentrate, which is going to change your reaction of the experience, and you're going to do different things with that. So just another example of how perceiving, reacting, and expressing is as common in our lives as breathing. And I invite you to play with the concept and see what you think. So another aspect of this is, in all of the examination we do, love is the key. The goal here is not to divide, to make one person right and the other person wrong, to not find the best. The goal is to find what is important for you and to find ways to support and help that come more forward, and to find out what interferes with the best of you coming forwards. And for that, you need love, not critical judgment so much as loving support. There is a place for critical judgment, but most of us have had too much of it in our lives. And in the tenderest of places in us, what we most yearn for, long for, and need is loving inclusion before we've cleaned it up. Loving inclusion of our eccentricities, loving inclusion of our difficulties, at being with, at expressing appreciation, and at understanding some things. So love is the key to all of this work, and sometimes making it simple, even silly. So that was a good part of week 1. In week 2, the guide suggested that there is a threshold of spiritual development. And the way he described it is there's a consequence, a result of letting the feelings out that is a new experience. That part of this, the spiritual work that I facilitate, that Pathwork focuses on, is of finding material that you haven't looked at yet. So it needs to be invited out. It needs to be let out. You need to see the feelings. There's a fear that if we feel the feelings, we will act upon them. And it's important to differentiate that. This work is not taught to children. It's taught to adults. You can feel something and not immediately take action upon that. But because we have in the past, especially when we weren't aware of the feeling, we can sometimes fear the feeling because of what happened after that. This is about coming in and creating some space so that we can really perceive what's going on, allow the feeling, allow the reaction, and then express in a safe environment, in a safe way, rather than acting out the feeling. We express what the feeling is. It allows us to hear the feeling more thoroughly, to be able to see it discreetly by itself instead of all the myriad things that have attached to it sometimes, especially in our past. So as a threshold of spiritual development, what its key is, instead of denying these emotions, which is a prejudgment, I already know they're wrong or not helpful or not what I want, is to meet and experience them. Experience the feeling, not experience them doing or targeting or saying out loud to people who aren't prepared to hold you as you learn to express. It's why work like this is done in smaller groups. It's important to feel the feeling and talk about it and find some ways to express it before you go into a more tense, less supportive environment and try to verbalize some subtleties about a situation that other people may not wish to hear. So it's bad enough that we may be saying something that people don't want to hear, and then we don't say it well, and then they are pointing out the deficits and we cower. We go into child consciousness about, I'm not good enough, I don't speak well enough. I can't tell you how many people on the groups that I facilitate really feel that they don't speak well. They say, I know I'm not going to describe this well, but they do describe it well. But they don't have confidence about doing so, which means they may do it in a small group meeting for that purpose, but they may not do it in their regular life. Imagine if you are a person who does express yourself well, imagine that you're trying to work with someone who is afraid to express anything connected to a feeling that they're not sure of. It limits their capacity to communicate with you. So this is important not only from our side, but from the side of the others that we love. Therefore, where we're strong, studying these concepts can help us understand where other people may not be strong and need support. An example I brought in to demonstrate this threshold is the 7 Stages of Grief by Kubler-Ross. And they're somewhat well known nowadays. And it was a revelation when she came up with them. So people just thought grief was grief and you either had it or you didn't. But what she was able to do was discern that there are different stages of grief. And it starts with shock. Now, the shock can last a month, a week, a day, 5 minutes, or even a second. But there's a moment of shock with grief, with severe loss, meaningful loss, a moment where you breathe in. I remember when the fire happened at Notre Dame. As a child, I lived in Europe for a few years. And there must have been a moment where the idea of something that large and important that I knew other people cared about being destroyed. It wasn't as personal to me as it was to other people. A few days ago, there was a report about in Los Angeles, there's a called Mount Wilson. There's an observatory there. And it isn't used as much as an observatory because of the lights of Los Angeles. So they use it for teaching, they use it for science programs, and they've got a huge planetarium there. That one I've gone to since I was a kid, as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, and then with my children. I've been to that location many times and had very pleasurable experiences. And when I saw that article in the news, that planetarium might be destroyed by surrounding bushfires, that I could feel viscerally for far more than a second. I'm not saying that one is more valuable than the other. Once again, this is very subjective. One I had more personal experience with. I had more emotional attachment to one group of buildings, one location, even though I cared for both of them and respected and admired what they both have to offer as congregate places, as important places for history. So it's just an example of how two things can be radically different. The shock can be momentary, it can last for a few moments, misuse of the word moments. The shock can be for a second, it can be for a half a minute. It can be something that you push through because you don't realize what's happened, and you go on and until you realize something's wrong days later. And this is an important element to realize in grief, is sometimes we don't move out of that shock for a significant period of time, even though we may be functional. Then after shock, there's denial. Oh, you've got to be kidding. Can't be. I need to check the news. You can't be correct. It must not be true. That can go as far as simply saying, I don't believe it. No matter how many people say it happened, I don't believe it. Then there is anger. There's frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotions, which may have nothing to do with the event. The event triggers it, and it's there. And so we try to express it in terms of our loss, but it's actually about many, many other things. There's a phase of bargaining. Well, maybe it's damaged, but it can be rebuilt, and maybe we can do this. Trying to soften, to ameliorate, to shift the amount of loss and its meaning to us. Then there is depression, where we've got the realization, we don't know what to do with it. And so it's a pause, but it can become a very stagnant pause, where we refuse to feel anything. Then there is testing, and this is somebody that when I read this article, they add this testing. You come in and out. You are in depression. You try to come out. You go back in and back and forth. All of these are very subjective, very broad brush descriptions. Then there's testing, where you're seeking a solution of some kind. What can I do with this information? What can I do with my life without this being? What can I do without this opportunity now that it is lost to me? And then there is acceptance. Now, why would I go through all this? I have found that by using popular psychology, modern phraseology, modern methods, modern knowledge, we take an age-old idea and give it more life. Take something that you're interested in and apply it there and see how it works. So take the 7 stages of grief, and what would each stage look like if each stage, and here's the trick, each stage, each contained perception, reaction, and expression. In fact, when each stage might start off with one cycle and then grow to another cycle and then grow to another cycle until it dissolves. So think of it like a flower or a piece of grass, that it grows and grows and grows and flowers, and then it releases and lets go. Because this is not a one-time event. So it's just another way of playing with this. You can understand the cycle and understand the myriad ways this can happen. And then you can say, and how does it apply to my life? The guide also suggests 2 points of awareness, and that is recognition that we're afraid of our feelings, that we are deeply, profoundly afraid of our feelings. And secondly, that we may have feelings that are negative and not want to give them up. So I may be afraid of what's in me, but I also may know or have an inkling of what's in me and not feel that I want to let it go yet. So this is 2 points of awareness to look at. So you don't want to go too aggressively into saying, let's fix me, let's fix the situation. It is important to realize that some tenderness may be needed here, some understanding that a person may not be ready to give up or withholding, to come completely forward. But just that awareness, which is the guide describes it as 2 points of awareness, just that awareness will help you to understand more deeply what might be going on. The idea is if you are aware of it and you understand it, that will feed more awareness, which is also a cycle, awareness and understanding, until you finally know what's going on, know what you want to do. And that awareness, understanding, and knowing comes from Pathwork Lecture 127, which is 4 stages of spiritual evolution. Step 1 is a place that he calls automatic reflex, where you don't know. So before awareness, you can't consciously work on something because you're not aware of it. So you're not aware, you're aware. You begin the process of understanding, which is a back and forth, until you have knowing. When I work with that lecture, I'm always giving examples such as driving a car, riding a bike. We don't remember when we used to get up and walk across the floor for the first time, but in that moment, we were learning something, we were aware, we were beginning to understand, and we nailed it. And then we fell down and we had to go through the process again until we were able to do that regularly without falling down. The most trivial and silly examples in life contain the same dynamic as the spiritual principles that Pathwork uses to focus on increased spiritual well-being and health and understanding. So if you're going to use a screwdriver, learn to use the screwdriver before you use it on something very sensitive where you only have a few opportunities, or that's very tender and sore. I'll let that one go for now. The guide also suggests that you really can control the flood of feelings. It is true that you may not have been able to at some point, but it is important to realize that you're not the person you were 5 years ago. You're not the person you were 10 years ago. You're not even the person you were 3 weeks ago. So becoming more aware of ourselves involves giving it another try and seeing if we're ready yet, rather than crossing something off as a painful, difficult experience that I don't want to undergo again, because then that place stays frozen and immature, undeveloped. So this is where we need to choose how we want to live, with more understanding and awareness, or in a frozen, arrested state of development. The guide says, fearing yourself and not knowing it makes you dead and makes you miss out on life. It makes you attach this very fear of yourself to any number of other and outer facets, which really have nothing to do with the fear itself, as it is in its original state. So in other words, if I am afraid of myself, I am afraid of you. Because if I can't trust me and I control me, how could I possibly trust you when I don't control you? And I don't know how you are controlling you. So I give exercises throughout the study guides. It was suggested by somebody who was part of the meetings and said, that's all great, but what do I do? And I realized that some help would be useful. I usually find the exercises in the lectures, but it is true, they're not as well delineated or not as easily seen by some people. So I just bring them out and shave them off and make them more obvious. So the guide suggests that when you hear this negation, which is I am afraid of myself, that you become honest and humble enough to pronounce it. And here's the quote that the guide offers. Very commonly, the guide offers a way to meditate on an issue and simply says, just say this. Say this many times over many days. And each time, notice this, you perceive what you're hearing, what you're saying, what you're hearing. You react to it and you express in terms of how you respond in that moment. And then you do it the next day and you perceive, react, and express. You do it the next day, you perceive, react, and express. This is not a one spoonful and you're done kind of work. So the meditation he suggests here is, I do not want to give anything of myself. Whether you think that's true or not, the guide's suggesting just say it. I do not want to give anything of myself. Whenever I feel threatened of rejection, criticism, frustration of my immediate desires, I at once withdraw from life, my vital energies, my goodwill, my positive spirit of participation in life. I want to remain unto myself in anger and resentment. I have that. I know that feeling. It comes and goes. It doesn't have to be a permanent thing. I don't have to be that person to have experienced that in a given moment in time. So whether or not this is a chronic problem for you, it is important to see that it could be an aspect in any given moment, in a given situation, that there is a lack of desire to go forward and deal with something, a resentment, a desire to hold the anger. And this leads into vicious circles where we can't get out of it because we don't want to get out of it. In week 3, I looked at how perception, or the guide looked at how perception, reaction, and expression become a threefold principle of relationship. If it is an essential guide to you, then it is an essential guide to your relationship with you. And if it's a guide to your relationship with you, then it will play out in your relationship with others. So it's an essential aspect of being with and understanding someone in their wonderful uniqueness and moment by moment reality, which may not match the previous hour, the previous day, week, or month. The delicious aspect of human beings is also the frustrating aspect of human beings, is we don't react the same way every time or consistently. And sometimes we take out, let me see if that phrase works. Sometimes we slip in a feeling in a place it's never been before and act as if nothing's changed. No, I've always hated apples. And someone says, but you love apples. No, I really have never liked apples, simply because you had a memory of a poor experience eating an apple and it came to you in that moment. In a way, it's blaming the apple for the negative experience that you haven't been able to process. And we all do that in relationship. So that's why the guide's saying this is a threefold principle of relationship. He suggests that your negativity is a defense, that negativity is a defense. Think of all the arguments you've ever had with people or the arguments you've felt from people. And sometimes there's a valid point overly emphasized. Very often there's a barking going on. There's a negativity going on that's a defensive negativity backed up with details. So it's important to not only see it in ourselves, but see it in others as examples, not blame or criticism. But I can see it in other people before I can see it in me. So I very often use seeing it in other people and then having to bring it home and find the nuances where it lives in me. So negativity as a defense, and that we can create a vicious circle of self-negativity and claim that it doesn't matter. It's only about me. But you can't corral negativity. It's like keeping a moldy, rotten thing in a portion of your kitchen and saying, oh, it won't affect anything else. Yes, it does affect other things. It spreads mold spores and stuff going through the air. So it's important to identify negativity wherever you find it, and to deal with it in terms of trying to find out what's going on. And then you can begin the process of saying, and how can we address this? We, meaning me and possibly other people. We always start with ourselves. So that was the gist of week 3, where this is a threefold principle of relationship. In week 4, the guide looked at how self-love empowers relationship. So this is the essence of the law of brotherhood. It is so common for good people to say, it's only me. I'm the problem. I'm bad. Everybody else is fine. As if that can happen. This is like the rotten thing in a kitchen. If I believe that I am unimportant, unlovable, then that means that the human experience is unlovable, because I am, in a humble way, I'm only part of the human experience. So to say, I, unique among all beings, that's how I tease people. I am unique among all beings for being totally unlovable. Perhaps you can see, I tease that to bring up the arrogance and the pride and the separation and the desire to stay, because they're building a case for, this is special. You can't touch this. You can't deal with this. But think about it in terms of, why would one human being be unlovable? What would be about that human being that would make them unlovable? And that's not true, as we see in human stories. The worst people among us have someone who loved them. Love is not dependent on your goodness. It's dependent upon the other person feeling met. So where self-love empowers relationship is if I am able to meet me in my imperfection. If I am able to accept and love without submission my negativity, meaning it's not where I want it to be, I get that, but I'm willing to see the truth of it for now, and I'm not going to leap on it and focus all my energy towards dealing with that. I'll try to work it in to my self-development so that it doesn't stay stuck and it begins to move and shift. If I can do that for me, then I can do it for you. But if I cannot do it for me, then I cannot do it for you. Now, where negativity comes in is where I can, but I won't. Then if you don't do it for someone else, there is a won't in that also. The question is, why wouldn't you be open to helping someone else communicate, live better, exist, communicate with you? So self-love is the essence of a good, healthy relationship. And we can have a good relationship without healthy self-love. That can be part of the developmental process. What I'm speaking of here is what will hold us back from increasing the health of our relationships. So if you're at a plateau point, it's like when you lose weight, if you're at a plateau point, you can't get any further, you need to look at your daily eating habits. You need to look at your exercise. You need to look at why the dynamic is stuck there and why it's not continuing to move. And it can get stuck on an aspect that you now need to work on that wasn't as important when you were doing other things. I often use housework as an analogy. I tease, it's a girl thing. It's not, but I just want to speak to, some people have that experience and some don't. Most women do have the experience, and I don't want to exclude anyone. So I tease about it. It's a girl thing. So when you look at a dirty room, which I have done all my adult life. As a kid, I made the dirty room. As an adult, I cleaned it up. When you look at a dirty room, you prioritize, you decide what you want to do first. That doesn't sound like much, But if you get completely overwhelmed by all the things that need to be done, you don't get anything done. So without realizing it, in multiple aspects of your life, when you look at a desk full of papers and you make the decision to clean it up, you do some things before you do others. You sort, or you look for specific paperwork, or you clear the dirty food wrappers off, or you make a decision to do something, and then you figure out what a starting point is. So when you clean a room, you decide, I'll move the dirty dishes and cups out, and then I'll get the laundry out, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do that. And you go down layer by layer by layer. You can live a full and happy life in a cluttered room. It's not hard to do at all. We all have our own level of comfort with clutter and with dirt. Nothing's ever fully clean, so we all have a comfort level with dirt. We just may not realize that dirt is there. And then one day we become aware of it and we may address it, or we may simply become more aware and understanding that we're not going any further. That's it. This is my level of cleanliness. Once again, sounds silly, but it's the same principle. I can only fix so much in a given day. I can see that there are other things in me that need addressing. I'm just going to have to pick something to get started with, or I'll become overwhelmed, and the overwhelm can be a negative intent to not do anything. So we're back to self-love empowers relationship. And self-love is something you can do without anybody else's permission. So the excuses of I don't have time, or I don't know how, or they won't let me, or they're not interested, which might work with other people, does not work with you unless you mean that and you are behaving negatively. And this is where awareness is part of the process. Go ahead and say that. Difference between saying it and shouting about it pridefully, you can do that too. But the idea here is not to try to defend yourself, but to find out what you truly feel, what's really going on. So the guide talks about self-perception, the distortion of self-perception. If you're at war with yourself by demanding to be other than what you are now, please hear that as you need to see what you are now, then you can change it. If you cannot do that, you cannot perceive yourself correctly. You're seeing something else. You're seeing through rose-colored glasses, and you will not be able to address what is true. There can be distortion in self-perception. There can be distortion in self-reaction. You still battle what is and insist on being the way you are not. It's a reaction against the perception. Thus, you do not perceive in truth, so that your reaction to it, when it indirectly or directly manifests, must be disharmonious and disturbing. It's not meeting reality. There can be distortion in self-expression. You cannot express the truth of what you perceive in yourself if you don't know it. If you don't wish to know it, that's the reaction part. Thus, the expression becomes one of hostility and rejection. And that lies behind a lack of self-love. And it's fear-based. I'm afraid of loving myself because I'm afraid I'm wrong. So I'll try to be right and hate myself. It's a distortion of love and caring. And then the guide describes a spiral of self-development. He says, if you're not at war with yourself, your perception will be clear. This will little by little change your entire life. When you study a spiritual discipline, sometimes you're basically trying to go fast. That's fine. You don't have to go fast. So some people can come get an idea from read a book, go to a meeting, listen to someone, and it's a germ of an idea. They can take that, they can work with it the rest of their life. That's movement. If they're happy with that, if that is satisfactory to them, then that is their spiritual path. If you want to rush, that's your spiritual path. The idea here is that if you may need to allow that some processes can be sped up and others cannot. And to, as the Serenity Prayer says, learn to tell the difference so that you're not pushing something that can't be pushed, becomes a distraction and a frustration. So this is not an easy formula to apply. It takes some maturity. The truth is simple. To put it into practice requires the maximum amount of investment and commitment on your part. Investment and commitment to the truth within, to the truth of your life, to the living spirit of perpetual growth. It demands time, perseverance, and wise, mature insight into the dynamics of growth. It requires a continuous groping for the right balance of letting the destructive, ignorant, irrational child in you express itself without falling into the trap of believing its truth is the truth, so that an intelligent dialogue can be established with the life-resisting part of your personality. Keep in mind that by identifying the life-resisting part of your personality, that perception is coming from the life-affirming part of your personality. And the shorter version of this, or the cute version of this, is it is an act of the higher self to see the lower self. Now, you may want to do something about it, and that's admirous. The first step may be to see it, and then to reflect, and then see it again and reflect. Now, this can happen very rapidly, or it can happen very slowly. But just to see if there's a push here that isn't about improving your life, but erasing your life, pretending that you didn't have a problem in the first place. So that's a summary of Pathwork Lecture 166, Perceiving, Perceiving, Reacting, and Expressing. Thanks for listening. I hope you go read the lecture. It's great. That's the section I read at the end of it. Thanks for listening.